During Lent, we've been trying to grow in our relationship with God in a renewed way, especially this Lent by learning how to recognize God in the midst of the different events, the thoughts, emotions, desires that can occur within us each day. So we've been using the rules for the Discernment of Spirits, which is by St. Ignatius of Loyola. 2 weekends ago, when I was last on the southern end, we learned about how the good spirit, which is God, Jesus, the Holy Spirit, and the bad spirit, our enemy, Satan, and the temptations that can arise within us, they interact with us in different ways. If we're striving to follow God each day, then God will want to strengthen us, encourage us, reassure us so that we can more easily stay on that path following Him. Last weekend, when I was up north, that was actually what Ignatius' third rule is all about. All these experiences of God's closeness and love are called spiritual consolations. So Ignatius gives many examples of what these can look like, and so that we can recognize them in our life. So if you're interested, go ahead and check it out on our website. You can listen to what all the different consolations are. It's important to know those. So if we're striving to follow God, God will give us these kinds of consolations to keep us going. But the bad spirit is also going to be at work in the opposite way, bringing thoughts that will disturb us, confusion, disquiet, fear within our hearts, feeling as though God isn't there. And these kinds of experiences, St. Ignatius describes in his fourth rule. He calls them spiritual desolations. Spiritual desolations. So for most of us on our spiritual journey trying to follow God, spiritual desolation is going to be one of the main obstacles that we face. So we need to learn to recognize it and to know how to respond to it. So we can first consider our first reading that we have today. The Israelites, they had been enslaved in Egypt for 400 years. But now God came to them in a powerful way, and they're able to escape. They experience His mighty deeds, crossing of the Red Sea, God's power and care for them. And so this would have been this moment of pretty obvious spiritual consolation, recognizing God's work in their lives. But now we get to what's happening in the first reading. They've crossed the Red Sea, and now they face the wide expanse of the desert before them. Traveling through the harsh winds and blowing sands and beating sun, water and food are scarce. They have to walk and walk and walk, seeming unendlessly. And we can imagine this kind of heaviness, discouragement, hopelessness, depression that begins to weigh upon their souls. They begin to complain in that reading. Why did we ever leave Egypt? We were better off there. At least we had food and water. Does God really care about us? Did He just bring us out here in the desert to die? Maybe we can think of moments like that. We feel that way. Thoughts that maybe God really isn't listening to what's going on. Maybe Jesus doesn't care. Maybe this faith is not as real as I thought it was. This is spiritual desolation. So just as the circumstances around them affected the Israelites, leading them into this kind of interior desolation, so the same is true for us. The circumstances of our lives can bring desolation as well. And in particular, the last several days, especially as the spread of COVID-19 continues to increase, cancellations, the different actions that we're called upon in different areas to protect ourselves, make it even more real for us. Much has been said through all of this of how to take care of ourselves physically, but what about the effects that all this has on us interiorly? Because it's not without effect. The disruption of the normal way of doing things, not knowing what exactly may happen, legitimate concerns, but then also maybe irrational fears. The heaviness, discouragement, confusion, and hopelessness for some. Questioning what's the future going to bring. Maybe questioning God's presence. And so these are experiences of desolation, some, beginning in like a non-spiritual area, but then moving to a spiritual kind of desolation. As I've mentioned before in other homilies during this series, that we all go through these kinds of ups and downs in our spiritual life. Sometimes where we feel God's really close, and other times where we find it difficult to recognize Him. And it's important to note that there is no shame in experiencing spiritual desolation. We all will experience it. The greatest saints experience times of interior desolation. But we also want to note that while consolations are things that God gives us, desolation does not come from Him. It doesn't come from Him. And the enemy wants to use it to throw us off track. So St. Ignatius, in his fourth rule, he goes through a number of examples of what spiritual desolations can look like in our lives so that we can name what it is and then reject it. It's not from God. So Ignatius says, I call desolation all the contrary of the third rule. So everything opposite of consolation is desolation. And first he says a darkness of soul. So that's kind of an experience of, times where we just can't figure things out. There's a lot of confusion about what I should do, especially when it comes to our relationship with God. There's this kind of overall heavy feeling within us that things are going badly and they're likely just going to get worse, and I don't know how to get out of it. It's kind of darkness in the soul. That's a spiritual desolation. Disturbance is the next one he uses. The peace maybe that we once had isn't there. There's trouble within my heart. Maybe I try to pray, but there's just so much anxiety that I can't even find comfort in the Lord right now. Maybe we try to go to church or be involved in like a Bible study that we usually, but the enjoyment or delight that we used to have in it is gone. This is a desolation that we're feeling. The next example he gives is a pull towards low and earthly things. So, say, for example, you're kind of alone at the end of the day, and things maybe didn't go as well as you'd planned. And there's this kind of grayness within my heart. And normally I'd pray, but I just don't have any desire for it. And there, just a few inches away, is the computer, or my phone, or the remote. And one click becomes 50, becomes 100, and it takes me to a place that I never wanted to go. Desolation, these are times where these kinds of gratifications are really going to try to draw us away from God. Going to the fridge a second, a third time. Getting up from the TV hours later. This pull towards low and earthly things that ultimately, they don't satisfy us. This is desolation. Agitations and temptations. So, in this, it could be memories of maybe past sins or past temptations that really bothered us and we've worked against, and maybe more recently, it hasn't really been a draw. But now, suddenly, all those things seem to come back, and they're really strong within us, trying to pull us in that direction. In times of desolation, we're much more susceptible to temptations. The next example he gives is feeling without confidence, without hope, without love. Maybe someone's used to praying regularly, but recently prayers kind of felt dry. Maybe it's, effects of other things going on in their life. And you sit down to pray, and after a few minutes, nothing's happening. And the thought is, why bother? Nothing's going to happen. It's just going to all be the same. Might as well just give up. Without any confidence, without any hope that God will do anything. Desolation. Next example is feeling all lazy, tepid, and sad. Maybe last several weeks I've been worried about something going on in my family, going on finances, illness, some kind of non-spiritual desolation at first, but maybe that's caused me to kind of let prayer kind of slip by the wayside. And the spiritual practices I used to do kind of got marginalized. And maybe the day approaches where I'm supposed to meet with this group or Bible study or Sunday Mass, and just inside I just feel so slothful and sad and just have no energy to do it. And the thought is, maybe I just won't go. That's desolation. And finally, the last one that Ignatius gives is feeling as if separated from God. feeling like God has abandoned us, that I'm isolated and alone. Now, it's important to note here what Ignatius says. He says, feeling as if separated from God. That's really important, as if. Because the truth is that we're not separated from God in times of desolation. He's still there. But this is one of the worst and deepest lies that desolation gets into our minds, that we are alone. But the reality is that we're not separated from God. We just simply don't feel the closeness, but he is still there. So seeing all these examples, maybe you can recognize moments in your life where, yeah, these are things that I've experienced. Maybe you didn't know that that's desolation. It doesn't come from God. We want to try to reject it. We can see it too in the life of the Samaritan woman in the gospel. She had been married 5 times, it says. We can imagine the kinds of things that went on in her life that led her to divorce after divorce. The failure of her first marriage putting her in such a state that she sought after all these other relationships that ended up being destructive for her instead of life-giving. Living with somebody now she's not married to. And because of all this, she'd been shunned completely by her community. That's why she was going to the well at the hottest hour of the day, because nobody wanted her around. But the beautiful thing about the gospel is that it teaches us that right there in the midst of that desolation for her, that's where Jesus comes. It's where he comes to give her the life-giving water, God's life again. And that's what Jesus wants to do to us whenever we're experiencing spiritual desolation. I think for us, one of the most relevant of these is the one where we might feel as if separated from God and from each other. It's especially important to recognize that this, I think, could be one of those places in which the enemy will try to attack us more strongly during this time, especially as we're, for the sake of our physical health, being asked to separate and kind of ourselves from one another, not being able to meet in gatherings of more than 250, so at least our small communities, we can still do for Mass compared to some of the larger ones, have to kind of limit things. Self-quarantine in some cases, especially of those that are elderly or more susceptible. So even though this isolation makes sense for physical health, it can be dangerous for spiritual health. Especially if we begin to believe that lie of spiritual desolation, that we are alone. Because the truth is that we are not alone, that God never abandons us. So it's especially important to work against that kind of a desolation that could arise within our hearts, this feeling of isolation. The Archbishop has, made the dispensation for everybody in the Archdiocese so that there's no penalty of sin if we don't go to Mass. So those that are especially susceptible to keep themselves safe. But the spiritual danger in that is that they need to make sure that we all keep connected to God and to each other, not to be isolated so that the enemy can work that kind of spiritual desolation within us. So, if things continue to grow, to especially look out for those in our families, those in our communities, who might feel especially isolated, and reach out to them. Maybe it's somebody that usually sits near you at Mass, but they're not here because they're quarantining themselves for health's sake. Phone calls, video chat. There's a couple days ago I realized I hadn't done that with my siblings, my family, for a while. I'm like, we need to do that. Just at this kind of a time, we need to make connections with each other. Even the most introverted among us, we're made for communion. And if things get to the point where we're no longer allowed to have Mass and even gather with smaller numbers, we'll have plans to want to help you to continue to be able to make Sunday holy, even from your homes. Even right now, we're testing out live streaming to make sure that get all the kinks out if we need to use that. Stay connected through the parish website, the Facebook pages, the mention at the beginning of Mass of the papers about signing up for the email or text if you haven't had a chance to do that, because that way we can continue to be connected and can know what's going on if we're not able to gather in person together. In the coming weeks, I'm going to continue the series on these Discernment of Spirits. And many of the coming rules that Ignatius gives to us is about how to deal with spiritual desolation that could arise within our hearts. Rules like, in times of desolation, don't make a change to our spiritual practices. So even if some things are changing around us, not to change our relationship with God. In fact, we ought to resist desolation with greater prayer. Consider how God is helping us even if we don't feel his presence. And to know that desolation doesn't last forever. And there's many other ones too. As we strive to care for our physical bodies, we want to also let the Lord care for our souls.